Hello, everyone. My name is Eduardo, as mentioned before, and today I'll be presenting identifying gaze behavior evolution via temporal fully weighted Scanpath graphs. So the first question I would like everyone to ask themselves is, what can gaze tell us about students' behavior? So in a very top level view, one of the main aspects of eye tracking is the eye-mind hypothesis, which states that there's a relationship between what we perceive through our eyes to what is happening in our brains and how we process new information. And a key aspect is be able to have some sort of a proxy through data-driven methods to be able to understand how people are perceiving and processing new data. And this correlates very much into how they perform and what are the strategies they act when they are in a learning or training environment. And hopefully by understanding better what they do through a data-driven method, we can design better interventions. So a popular new technique that is being developed in eye tracking research is through gaze network analysis, where they construct a Scanpath graph. And a great work by Clariana et al. They found a correlation between the Scanpath graph's typology to the strategy they were performing in a reading learning environment. And so, for example, on the left, you'll see that it's linear. That's correlated with goal-oriented strategies. And as they transition to more of a star pattern, this is kind of associated with naive approaches to interacting with that environment. And expertise is being able to transition from this different typologies to best fit the task that you're performing. So this correlates that there's a change based on the new needs in the environment. And so what we observed is there was a limitation in gaze network analysis where a lot of the graphs were computed and constructed at the end of the session. But what we propose is to use a temporal graph, which is also known as dynamic graphs, where we take a more time series approach where scan paths are generated throughout the whole scenario. And eventually the goal would be that you actually use these graphs to create personalized, timely feedback during the actual session. So now that we have an idea of how we want to approach, we need to think of a concrete context that we can actually try to implement this approach. So we have chosen the nursing domain, specifically in team simulation training. So in this case, we have 3 student nurses and 1 instructor who's acting as the patient. And each nurse is wearing a Tobii eye tracker glasses, which is a head-mounted eye tracking glasses that records video, audio, and gaze. Along we have also overhead cameras that are capturing along with video and audio. And on the right side, you can actually see a layout of the room. So the patient is laying in the bed in the center, and then the nurses are surrounding the patient and interacting with the patient, but also other objects in the environment, such as their chart and their vitals. And then the instructor is looking through a one-way mirror, observing what the students are performing. They are enacting the patient and overall orchestrating the progression of the simulation so that we can get some sort of learning gains through it. And our research question that we're interested in is, how can eye tracking data be used to provide contextualized information about nurses' activity and behavior in a complex mixed reality simulation-based training? I know that's a long question, so let's get to it. So to start, let's relate this to learning theory. So we use the cognitive paths model as a way to approach this. And just to go over it quickly, it is a hierarchical tree-like structure from where the top involves a domain general task, and then as you progress further down, they're related to more domain-specific tasks. So for nursing, for example, on the left, bottom left, you'll see physical is a task that wouldn't be appropriate for nursing. And this task model was generated and co-developed with the nursing domain experts. And then the goal that we want to do is, can we go from eye tracking data to identifying this task? And primarily, we focused on those that were highlighted, which is general information gathering, diagnostic information gathering, civilization, and treatment. So to start, since we are collecting egocentric views from the Tobii eye trackers, what we ended up using is we used YOLO V5, which is a deep learning object detection model, to find areas of interest throughout the video. So for example, here you see the monitor. And what we do is we match that to the gaze that is being collected as well. And we're able to determine what the objects they looked at that were related to the nursing domain. Once we process the 3 nurses' videos and general data, we're able to actually create a whole timeline of AOI sequences, which are related to the objects that you see there, which are a total of 9 objects. The primary ones you want to look at are person, bed, and monitor. And the goal is, this timeline is very noisy. It's hard to make an inference from it. What we want to be able to do is construct time segments from this AOI sequences that are related to the cognitive tasks that we have highlighted before. So this is our methodology. We do an approach of non-overlapping sliding window, where a graph is constructed every 15 seconds, since that is the size of our window. And at the end, we generate that graph, which uses the previous graphs as a starting point. The way that these graphs are added is that if an object was seen within the window, the duration of which they looked at that object is added to the node's weights that's associated with that. So, for example, if they looked at the person for 10 seconds, the node associated with person was added 10 seconds within that window. As well for transitions, if they look at object A and then switch to object B n times, we sum n to the edge between those two nodes. So that's how we were able to add weights to the nodes and edges. To actually involve decaying, well, we do the contrary. If they didn't look at a certain object within that window, or if there was not a transition between those two objects, then we decayed it by a 4% ratio. This was determined through manual hyperparameter search, where it was right in the middle of the ideal, where if it was too low of a decay rate, the typology of the graph becomes stagnated and would not really change, not provide us new information. But if it was too high of a decay rate, it would deteriorate the graph and it would not actually really create any other typology as well. So this was right in the middle so that it would be ideal. So this is an example of a scenario where the three nurses are going and reprocessing their eye tracking, being able to generate those sequences and then create those graphs. And I'm playing it quite quickly since we have limited time, but this is the general idea of how we create those graphs throughout the simulation. So now that we have created this great intermediate representation, what do we do with it? And for any machine learning algorithm, you require that your inputs are vectorized, and graphs do not fit well with this. So we had to come up with a lossless vectorization technique. And so what we ended up doing is we grabbed the adjacency matrix, which includes the edge information, and we flatten it to an 81 element long vector. And then we concatenate it with a node weight vector. And we resulted with a 90 element long graph embedding. This was a lossless, so it is important that we preserve the information for future referencing. Once we were able to come up with a vectorization technique, what we ended up doing is we grabbed 5 different simulation scenarios with different participants, and we did the same process that we just discussed. We processed the video, found the AUIs, created the graph, and then vectorized those graphs. And that resulted in 2,250 data points. We then used those data to train a k-means clustering algorithm and use k-elbow to determine the optimal number of clusters, which ended up to be 5. Once we had our clusters, each cluster has a mean that is the same size as the input, which is 90 elements long. This is great that we did a lossless vectorization because that means that we can actually grab those vectors of the means and return them back and generate a graph that, in a sense, is the representative of each cluster. This helps us be able to actually characterize what these clusters mean. So now we need to actually start to interpret and correlate our data to the learning theory. So the first step was, well, the highest level of the cognitive task model is the information gathering and intervention. And we associated that the person and the monitor would be related to information gathering, as these nodes are typically information hubs where people seek new information about the simulation. While intervention, we mark that the bed, which is typically analogous with the patient, and another person would be related with intervention and interacting with the patient overall. So given that, you'll see that cluster 4 and cluster 1 have larger node and edge weights for person and monitor, while cluster 2 and 3 had larger node and edge weight values for the patient or the bed and the person. So that's our first split. So we were able to split for our first level, the cognitive task model. Let's take it one step further. So what we've emphasized is that in the top left, for example, there is a larger emphasis. There's a larger node weight for monitor, and monitor typically provides general chart information about the patient. So this, we attached it to the general cognitive task. While on the top right, there's a larger emphasis on the person, which would relate with this nursing student probing the patient and figuring out what could be wrong and coordinating with their members. So we mark this as diagnostic. Then on the bottom left, we mark that stabilization would be related with the monitoring of new information and verifying that the patient health improves. So it has a more of an even distribution between the 3 main classes that we're interested in, which is bed, person, and monitor. While in the contrast, treatment was associated with patient and monitor interaction. So being able to actually start new treatment, coordinating with fellow nurses to see if the treatment plan is going to actually achieve the long-term benefits that we are interested for the patient. Now that we have associated our clusters and we can actually use the train k-means algorithm, we're going to use the case study. So we graphed a simulation with 3 nurses. And on the left, you'll see the graph. We have P1, P2, and P3. These are the raw gaze data, and which is quite hard to interpret. But what we use our k-means algorithm that was trained and inferenced it. And you'll see P1C, P2C, and P3C are the cluster IDs temporally. And the important part to observe in this trend for this plot is that on the left side, the cluster IDs are warm tones, which are associated with information gathering. And on the later parts, it is the cooler tones, which are related with intervention. Let's take it a step further. You can actually see that sequentially, the nurses, I'm sorry, maybe it's a little hard to see with the shades of the here, but they initially start with general information gathering as they're focused more on the monitor and general information that they have been provided. But then they start to interact more with the actual patient and extracting information from him. And then the stabilization starts to be the next procedure as they're trying to resolve any kind of immediate health hazard. And then later, they'll actually start doing treatments. Now, since there's 3 nurses, they're going to delegate different roles. So they'll do different things at different times. So that's why you'll see the different ones took that. And on the top right, we have a table of events that are essential for identifying what's going on in the simulation. A good example for analyzing the transitions between these clusters IDs is event 3, which I'll just read it out loud. It is when the patient requests help because they're not feeling well. And prior to that, the nursing students were just kind of assessing the situation. And you'll see that on event 3, which is on the left side, they start to slowly transition from the information gathering phase to an actual intervention as the patient's requesting immediate help. So to return back to our research question about how can we use eye tracking to contextualize it and then understand students' behaviors in this complex environment, as a lot of eye tracking research is done, it's about contextualizing it to the domain. Original raw eye tracking data is just XY values that don't tell us much. So what we need to be able to do is use, for example, Tobii eye tracking glasses that help us deal with mixed reality environments, and then use YOLO-V5 to identify where they're locating. That way we can actually know what objects to look at related to the nursing domain. And then to actually understand their behaviors and how that changed in the environment, we use the clustering graphs to be able to determine those time segments that are related with the cognitive task. It helps us understand what is basically the evolution of their behavior throughout the simulation according to a cognitive task model. So like any other research, there's obvious limitations in future work that we hope to address. And the first one is YOLO-V5, where the bounding boxes that we obtain are semantic. So they don't provide us identity. They just say person rather than nurse 1. And this is a limitation in that we cannot track more nuanced interactions between specific nurses. But one of our colleagues, Caleb Batchel, is doing some great work with head tracking to enhance this tracking ability and being able to resolve this later. And then also we use the generic pre-trained weights of the COCO dataset, which only have certain objects, but are not perfectly fitted for our nursing domain. So we hope in the future to create our own trained YOLO version. Then our graph embedding, as you might have noticed, is not scalable. As the objects increase, there's an n-squared relationship to the vectorization size. So we need to think of a better embedding rate if we're going to want to increase objects. And then ultimately, something that we're all pushing for is to combine the post-simulation student and instructor reflections to match them to the analysis that we have made. Of course, we need to actually incorporate some of the human in the loop parts. So that's something that we're hoping to do in future work. Ultimately, this was a team endeavor, and I'm very grateful for all the great work that everyone put into this paper. And all the authors would like to show their appreciation to the nursing simulation lab at Vanderbilt. And they were able to be our ambassadors to the domain, and they provided a lot of their expertise. And this project was partially funded by the Army Research Laboratory Award, NSF Cyber Learning Award, and the Vanderbilt's Chancellor's funding of the LIVE Initiative. And this was a joint collaboration by the Peabody College and Department of Computer Science. So what are your questions?